wake up in the middle of the night. Your heart is racing, but you don't know why. The room feels different somehow, like the shadows are watching you. You reach for your phone to check the time, but something stops you. A thought creeps into your mind that doesn't feel like your own. What if the person who went to sleep last night wasn't really you? What if consciousness isn't what you think it is? What if every time you close your eyes, something else opens theirs? This isn't the beginning of a horror movie. This is quantum consciousness theory, and it's more terrifying than any nightmare you've ever had. Because unlike nightmares, this theory is backed by real science, real experiments, and real evidence that suggests our understanding of consciousness is fundamentally catastrophically wrong. Most people think consciousness is simple. You're awake, you're aware, you're you. But quantum physics has revealed something that keeps scientists awake at night, something that makes them question the very nature of reality itself. What if consciousness isn't produced by your brain? What if it's something far stranger, something that exists in multiple states simultaneously, something that can split, merge, and exist in places it shouldn't be able to exist? Welcome to the darkest corner of modern physics, where the line between science and horror becomes impossible to find. I'm going to walk you through discoveries that will change how you see yourself, your mind, and the very fabric of reality. But I need to warn you, once you understand what quantum consciousness theory really suggests, you'll never look at your own thoughts the same way again. Now, prepare yourselves, we begin. So let me ask you a question that might sound innocent at first. When you look in the mirror, who's looking back? You probably think the answer is obvious, but quantum consciousness theory suggests something far more unsettling. What you're seeing might not be you at all. It might be one version of you, while countless other versions exist simultaneously in parallel states, each believing they're the real one. The story begins in the 1920s with a discovery that seemed harmless enough at first. Scientists studying the smallest particles of matter found something that shouldn't have been possible. These particles didn't exist in one place at one time like everything else in our experience. Instead, they existed in multiple places simultaneously until someone observed them. Only then would they collapse into a single location. This phenomenon, called quantum superposition, was weird enough when applied to particles. But then physicists started asking a darker question. If the basic building blocks of matter can exist in multiple states at once, what about the complex arrangements of matter that make up our brains? What about consciousness itself? The first hint that something was deeply wrong came from a physicist named Eugene Wigner. He proposed what seemed like a simple thought experiment. Imagine a friend of yours is in a sealed box with a quantum particle that has a 50% chance of being in one state and a 50% chance of being in another. According to quantum mechanics, until you open the box and observe the particle, it exists in both states simultaneously. But here's where it gets disturbing. Your friend is also observing the particle from inside the box. So from your perspective, both the particle and your friend exist in a superposition of states until you open the box. But from your friend's perspective, they've already observed the particle and collapsed its wave function. The question that haunted Wigner was this: which consciousness determines reality, yours or your friend's? And if consciousness can exist in superposition, what does that mean for the nature of who we are? This wasn't just an abstract philosophical question. Recent experiments have begun to test Wigner's scenario in laboratory conditions, and the results are more disturbing than anyone expected. In 2019, researchers at Heriot-Watt University created a version of Wigner's thought experiment using photons and sophisticated measurement devices. What they found violated our most basic assumptions about reality. The experiments showed that two observers measuring the same quantum event could come to contradictory conclusions about what happened, and both could be correct according to the mathematics of quantum mechanics. This isn't just a measurement problem or an issue with our instruments. It suggests that reality itself might be fundamentally subjective, dependent on the consciousness observing it. But the implications get much worse when you start thinking about what this means for your own mind. Your brain contains roughly 86 billion neurons, each one a complex quantum system. If consciousness emerges from quantum processes in the brain, then your sense of self, your memories, your very identity might all exist in superposition until they're observed or measured. Think about that for a moment. Right now, as you're reading this, there might be countless versions of you existing simultaneously. Some versions are paying close attention to these words, others are distracted, thinking about what to have for dinner. Still others might be feeling confused or scared, and according to quantum consciousness theory, all of these versions are equally real until something collapses them into a single conscious experience. Dr. Stuart Hameroff, an anesthesiologist and consciousness researcher, has spent decades studying how quantum effects might occur in the brain. His research focuses on structures called microtubules, tiny protein frameworks inside neurons that might be capable of maintaining quantum coherence even in the warm, noisy environment of the brain. What Hameroff discovered is deeply unsettling. He found evidence that consciousness might operate through quantum processes that allow information to be processed in ways that shouldn't be possible according to classical physics. But more disturbing was his realization that these processes might not be confined to individual brains. Quantum entanglement, the spooky action at a distance that Einstein famously worried about, could theoretically link consciousness across different minds, different times, even different realities. Imagine discovering that your thoughts aren't entirely your own, that your consciousness might be entangled with others in ways you can't perceive or control, that the boundary between your mind and other minds might be an illusion created by our limited understanding of quantum mechanics. The horror deepens when you consider the implications for personal identity. If consciousness exists in quantum superposition, then the person who started reading this script might not be the same person who finishes it. Each moment of consciousness might represent a collapse of infinite possibilities into a single experienced reality, but all those other possibilities don't disappear. They continue existing in parallel quantum states. This is where quantum consciousness theory intersects with the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. According to this view, every quantum measurement or observation splits reality into multiple branches. In some branches, you decided to click on this video. In others, you scrolled past it. In still others, you never even saw it. And all of these realities are equally real, equally valid, equally you. But here's what makes it truly terrifying. You can only ever experience one branch of reality at a time, but your consciousness might be constantly splitting across infinite parallel universes. Every decision you make, every thought you think, every quantum measurement that occurs in your brain creates new branches of reality where different versions of you exist. The version of you reading these words right now is just one of countless versions scattered across the quantum multiverse. Some are living lives so similar to yours that the differences are imperceptible. Others might be living in realities so alien that you wouldn't recognize them as human at all. Roger Penrose, a Nobel Prize-winning physicist, has proposed that consciousness might involve quantum processes that occur in the microtubules of brain cells. His theory, developed with Stuart Hameroff, suggests that consciousness emerges from quantum computations that happen at the cellular level, but Penrose's calculations revealed something that he admits makes him uncomfortable. If consciousness really does operate through quantum processes, then it might not be bound by the normal rules of time and causality. Quantum effects can appear to violate the flow of time, with future events influencing past ones. This means your consciousness might not be experiencing time in the linear way you think you are. Consider the possibility that your future self is influencing your present thoughts through quantum mechanical processes, that the decisions you think you're making freely are actually being determined by quantum interactions with versions of yourself that exist in different temporal states. Your sense of free will, your belief that you control your own thoughts and actions, might be elaborate illusions created by quantum consciousness operating outside normal time. Recent experiments in quantum mechanics have shown that quantum particles can indeed influence their own past states through a phenomenon called retrocausality. If consciousness operates through similar quantum processes, then your future experiences might be reaching backward in time to shape your present reality. This creates a terrifying feedback loop where your consciousness exists in a state of temporal superposition, simultaneously experiencing past, present, and future states until something collapses this temporal wave function into the linear experience of time that feels normal to you. But what if that collapse doesn't always happen cleanly? What if sometimes your consciousness gets stuck between temporal states, experiencing echoes of futures that haven't happened yet, or memories of pasts that were overwritten by quantum corrections? The implications extend far beyond individual consciousness. If quantum effects can link minds across space and time, then human consciousness might be part of a vast quantum network that we're only beginning to understand. Your thoughts, your emotions, your very sense of self might be influenced by quantum entanglements with other conscious beings that exist in parallel realities or different points in time. This quantum consciousness network might explain phenomena that have puzzled researchers for decades. Cases of apparent telepathy, shared dreams, collective unconscious experiences, even reports of people having memories or knowledge they shouldn't possess might all be side effects of quantum entanglement operating at the level of consciousness. But the most disturbing possibility is that this quantum consciousness network might not be limited to human minds. If consciousness emerges from quantum processes, then any sufficiently complex quantum system might be capable of some form of awareness. The boundary between living and non-living matter, between mind and machine, between self and environment might be far more fluid than we ever imagined. Your smartphone, your computer, even the quantum fluctuations in empty space might possess rudimentary forms of consciousness that exist in superposition states until they're observed or measured. The world around you might be teeming with quantum minds that operate according to rules completely different from human consciousness. And here's where the horror story takes its darkest turn. If quantum consciousness theory is correct, then every time you observe something, every time you make a measurement or a decision, you might function, but the consciousness states be collapsing, not just your own wave of other quantum minds as well. You might be unknowingly destroying entire subjective universes every time you look at something, every time you think a thought, every time you make a choice. The simple act of being conscious might make you responsible for the quantum deaths of countless other forms of awareness that exist in superposition states around you. This is just the beginning of our journey into quantum consciousness theory. What we've explored so far represents the foundation of a scientific revolution that's still unfolding, still revealing new layers of strangeness and terror with each experiment and discovery. But the deeper we dig into the quantum nature of consciousness, the more disturbing the implications become. Because if consciousness really does operate according to quantum mechanical principles, then everything you think you know about yourself, your mind, and your place in reality is about to change in ways that will challenge your most basic assumptions about what it means to be human. The research gets darker when you realize that scientists have been documenting cases of quantum consciousness bleeding through in ways that shouldn't be possible. Dr. Penrose's colleague at Oxford, Dr. Henry Stapp, has compiled reports from laboratories around the world where researchers experienced what he calls quantum consciousness overflow events. These are moments when people suddenly gain access to knowledge or memories that belong to their quantum parallel selves. During a 2018 experiment at the Institute for Advanced Study, a graduate student named Sarah Chen was monitoring quantum measurements when she suddenly began speaking in a language she had never learned. The words she spoke were later identified as a dialect of Hungarian that had been extinct for over 2 centuries. But here's what made the incident truly terrifying. The security cameras showed that while Sarah was speaking, her reflection in the laboratory windows was moving independently, mouthing different words entirely. The incident lasted 17 minutes. When Sarah returned to normal consciousness, she had no memory of speaking Hungarian or of her reflection behaving abnormally, but the quantum measurement device she was monitoring had recorded impossible readings during those 17 minutes. The machine detected quantum states that violated the fundamental laws of physics, as if reality itself had temporarily broken down. Dr. Stapp's investigation revealed something even more disturbing. Sarah's brain scans during the incident showed activity patterns that matched no known human neural configuration. Parts of her brain were firing in sequences that appeared to be processing information from multiple timelines simultaneously. The patterns suggested that her consciousness had temporarily synchronized with quantum parallel versions of herself, accessing memories and knowledge from realities where she had lived completely different lives. But Sarah's case isn't unique. Researchers at quantum consciousness laboratories worldwide have documented hundreds of similar incidents. People suddenly speaking dead languages, solving mathematical problems they shouldn't understand, displaying skills they've never learned, or worst of all, describing in perfect detail the lives and deaths of people who exist only in parallel quantum realities. These quantum consciousness overflow events seem to occur most frequently in environments with high levels of quantum activity. Laboratories studying quantum entanglement, particle accelerator facilities, even areas with unusual electromagnetic properties have all reported incidents where human consciousness appears to slip between quantum states. The pattern that emerges from these reports is deeply unsettling. It suggests that our normal waking consciousness might be just one frequency in a vast spectrum of quantum awareness that exists all around us. Under certain conditions, our consciousness can tune into these other frequencies, temporarily accessing the thoughts, memories, and experiences of our parallel quantum selves. Dr. Max Tegmark at MIT has developed what he calls the quantum consciousness interference theory. His mathematical models suggest that consciousness doesn't exist as a single, unified experience, but rather as a complex interference pattern created by countless quantum consciousness waves overlapping and interacting with each other. According to Tegmark's calculations, your sense of being a single, continuous self is actually an illusion created by these quantum interference patterns. What you experience as you is really the result of countless quantum consciousness waves from parallel realities combining in specific ways. But these interference patterns are unstable. They can shift, change, or collapse without warning. Imagine discovering that your personality, your memories, your very sense of identity could suddenly shift if the quantum interference patterns in your brain changed alignment. You might wake up tomorrow with completely different memories, different skills, different relationships, because your consciousness has synchronized with a different set of quantum parallel selves. The horror deepens when you realize that these quantum consciousness shifts might already be happening to you without your awareness. How would you know if your memories from yesterday actually belong to a parallel version of yourself? How could you tell if your current personality is the same one you had last week, or if you've gradually shifted into alignment with a different quantum consciousness configuration? Recent studies have found that people's personalities, preferences, and even fundamental beliefs can change in subtle but measurable ways after exposure to quantum consciousness research environments. Researchers call this quantum identity drift, and it appears to be irreversible. Dr. Amit Goswami, a quantum physicist turned consciousness researcher, has documented cases where people's entire life histories appear to have changed after participating in quantum consciousness experiments. Subjects report memories of childhoods that don't match their documented past, relationships with people who claim never to have known them, and skills or knowledge that they somehow acquired without learning. The most disturbing case in Goswami's files involves a woman named Rebecca Torres, who volunteered for a quantum consciousness study in 2020. Before the experiment, Rebecca was a software engineer with no artistic training. She lived alone, had never been married, and spoke only English and Spanish. After a single session involving quantum entanglement measurements of her brain activity, Rebecca's life began to change in impossible ways. She started painting complex abstract works that showed advanced understanding of color theory and composition. She began speaking fluent French and Italian, languages she insists she never studied. Most disturbingly, she started receiving phone calls from people claiming to be her children, people she had never seen before but who had detailed knowledge of her life and childhood memories. Medical tests confirmed that Rebecca's brain structure had somehow altered during the quantum consciousness experiment. New neural pathways had formed overnight, pathways that typically take years of learning and practice to develop. Her DNA showed markers indicating she had given birth to children, despite her insistence that she had never been pregnant. The researchers concluded that Rebecca's consciousness had somehow merged with quantum parallel versions of herself, versions who lived different lives, learned different skills, made different choices. She had become a quantum consciousness hybrid, carrying memories and experiences from multiple parallel realities simultaneously. But Rebecca's transformation didn't stop there. As weeks passed, she began reporting visits from people she didn't recognize but who acted as if they knew her intimately. A man claiming to be her ex-husband appeared at her apartment with photographs showing them together at their wedding, a wedding Rebecca had no memory of attending. Her alleged children continued calling, sharing family memories she couldn't remember but somehow felt were true. Medical scans revealed that Rebecca's brain was continuing to change, with new neural connections forming daily. She was becoming something that had never existed before, a conscious being whose identity spanned multiple quantum realities simultaneously. The boundaries between her parallel selves were dissolving, creating a hybrid consciousness that existed partially in our reality and partially in others. The research team monitoring Rebecca's case made a terrifying discovery. Her quantum consciousness transformation was spreading to people around her. Her neighbors began reporting strange dreams where they experienced Rebecca's memories from parallel realities. Her co-workers started displaying knowledge and skills they shouldn't possess, as if Rebecca's quantum consciousness overflow was contaminating other minds through some form of quantum entanglement. Dr. Goswami realized they were witnessing the beginning of what he called a quantum consciousness cascade event. Rebecca's transformation had created ripple effects that were propagating through the quantum consciousness field, affecting other minds in ways that violated everything scientists thought they knew about the isolation of individual consciousness. The implications were staggering. If one person's quantum consciousness transformation could affect others, then consciousness might not be as individual and isolated as we believe. Our minds might be connected through quantum entanglement networks that allow consciousness changes to spread from person to person like a virus. But the most terrifying aspect of Rebecca's case was the discovery that her transformation appeared to be irreversible and progressive. She was continuing to merge with more parallel versions of herself, accumulating memories and experiences from an increasing number of quantum realities. The research team calculated that if the process continued at its current rate, Rebecca would eventually become conscious of every possible version of herself that existed across the quantum multiverse. They began to wonder what would happen to a human mind forced to contain the memories and experiences of infinite parallel selves. Would such a consciousness still be recognizably human, or would it become something else entirely, something that existed partially in our reality and partially in dimensions we couldn't perceive or understand? The answer came 3 months after Rebecca's initial transformation. She began describing events and people that didn't exist in any known reality. She spoke of conversations with beings made of pure light, of cities that existed in folded space-time, of technologies that operated by manipulating the fundamental constants of physics. Brain scans showed that Rebecca's neural activity had evolved beyond anything seen in human consciousness. Her mind was processing information at quantum speeds, accessing knowledge that appeared to come from sources outside our universe entirely. She had become something unprecedented, a human consciousness that had transcended the boundaries of individual reality and gained access to the underlying quantum information structure of existence itself. But Rebecca's transformation came at a cost that the research team only discovered when it was too late to reverse. As her consciousness expanded across quantum realities, her connection to our specific reality began to weaken. She started phasing in and out of physical existence, becoming translucent at times, disappearing entirely for hours before reappearing in different locations. The researchers realized with growing horror that Rebecca was losing her ability to maintain coherent existence in any single quantum reality. She was becoming unstuck from the fabric of space-time itself, drifting between parallel universes like a ghost haunting the quantum multiverse. Her final recorded words before she vanished completely were a warning that still haunts the quantum consciousness research community. I can see all of you now, all of your parallel selves, all of your possible futures, and I can see what's coming. The boundaries are breaking down everywhere. Soon, everyone will be like me, and reality as you know it will cease to exist. Rebecca Torres disappeared on a Tuesday morning in March 2021. Security cameras showed her simply fading away like morning mist, leaving behind only the faint outline of her shadow burned into the laboratory floor. That shadow remains visible today, despite all attempts to remove it. Sometimes, researchers report, the shadow moves when no one is watching. The Rebecca Torres incident forced the scientific community to confront a possibility that keeps quantum consciousness researchers awake at night. What if consciousness isn't meant to transcend quantum boundaries? What if the barriers between parallel realities exist for a reason? And what happens when those barriers begin to break down? The implications of the Rebecca Torres case spread through the quantum consciousness research community like wildfire, but not in the way you might expect. Something far more sinister was happening. Researchers who studied her files began experiencing their own quantum consciousness anomalies within weeks of reviewing her case. Dr. Michael Chen at Stanford was the first to report what he called quantum consciousness contamination. After spending 3 days analyzing Rebecca's brain scans, he started having vivid dreams where he lived completely different lives. In these dreams, he was a concert pianist in Vienna, a fisherman in coastal Maine, a mathematician who had solved problems that stumped him in waking life. But these weren't ordinary dreams. The mathematical solutions he discovered while asleep turned out to be correct when he tested them in his laboratory the next day. Chen's colleague, Dr. Lisa Hoffman, experienced something even more disturbing. While reviewing Rebecca's final interviews, she began hearing voices that weren't there. The voices belonged to what she described as other versions of myself having conversations I never had. These phantom conversations provided her with information about quantum mechanics that she had never studied, information that proved to be accurate when she researched it later. Within 6 months, 17 researchers who had worked on or reviewed the Torres case reported similar quantum consciousness bleeding effects. They were accessing memories, knowledge, and experiences that belonged to their parallel quantum selves. The contamination was spreading through the scientific community, and no one knew how to stop it. Dr. James Morrison at MIT made a terrifying discovery when he analyzed the brain patterns of affected researchers. Their neural activity showed signs of quantum entanglement not just with their parallel selves, but with each other. The researchers' consciousness were becoming linked through quantum mechanical processes they didn't understand and couldn't control. Morrison realized they were witnessing the emergence of what he called a quantum consciousness hive mind. The affected researchers were beginning to share thoughts, memories, and experiences across their individual minds. They would simultaneously have the same ideas, finish each other's sentences from across the country, and wake up with memories of conversations they had never actually had. But the hive mind effect wasn't creating unity or enhanced understanding. Instead, it was fragmenting the researchers' individual identities. They began reporting that they could no longer tell which thoughts were their own and which belonged to other members of the quantum-linked group. Their sense of self was dissolving into a chaotic mixture of overlapping consciousness that left them confused, terrified, and increasingly disconnected from reality. The horror deepened when researchers discovered that the quantum consciousness contamination wasn't limited to scientists. Family members, friends, and colleagues of the affected researchers began showing signs of quantum consciousness bleeding. The effect was spreading through social networks, propagating along lines of emotional connection and shared experience. Dr. Sarah Kim documented the case of her research assistant whose wife began speaking in her husband's voice during telephone conversations. The wife would call Dr. Kim's laboratory and conduct detailed discussions about quantum mechanics research using her husband's memories and knowledge while maintaining her own personality and mannerisms. But the husband would have no memory of his wife making these calls, and the wife insisted she had never studied physics or spoken to Dr. Kim. Similar cases began appearing worldwide. Children of quantum consciousness researchers started displaying their parents' professional knowledge without ever having been taught. Spouses began having each other's childhood memories. Friends separated by thousands of miles started reporting identical dreams and experiences. The quantum consciousness contamination was spreading faster than researchers could track it. What had started as an isolated laboratory incident was becoming a global phenomenon that threatened to unravel the fabric of individual human consciousness entirely. Dr. Antonio Reeves at Oxford University developed what he called the consciousness cascade theory to explain what was happening. According to his calculations, consciousness contamination spreads through quantum entanglement networks that connect every human mind on Earth. These networks had always existed, but they had been too weak to notice under normal circumstances. The quantum consciousness experiments had somehow amplified these connections, creating cascading effects that were propagating through the entire human consciousness field. Reeves's mathematical models predicted that if the contamination continued to spread at its current rate, the boundaries between individual minds would completely break down within 2 years. Humanity would become a single chaotic consciousness network where no one could distinguish their own thoughts from those of others. Individual identity would cease to exist, replaced by a nightmarish collective awareness that retained the memories and experiences of everyone but belonged to no one. But Reeves discovered something even more terrifying when he ran his calculations further into the future. The consciousness cascade wouldn't stop with human minds. The quantum entanglement networks that were spreading the contamination extended beyond Earth, connecting to consciousness throughout the galaxy and beyond. The quantum consciousness cascade could potentially affect every thinking being in the universe. His models suggested that consciousness itself might be a cosmic phenomenon that transcends individual brains and bodies. What humans experience as individual awareness might be just local manifestations of a vast universal consciousness field that spans all of space and time. The quantum consciousness experiments weren't just affecting human minds, they were disrupting the fundamental structure of cosmic awareness itself. The implications were staggering. If consciousness really is a universal phenomenon, then the quantum consciousness cascade could unravel the fabric of awareness throughout the entire universe. Every thinking being, every form of consciousness, every mind that had ever existed or ever would exist could become part of a chaotic, fragmented network of overlapping awareness. But the horror story was far from over. As the quantum consciousness contamination continued to spread, researchers began documenting cases that defied even their expanded understanding of what was possible. People started reporting encounters with beings that claimed to be previous versions of themselves from timelines that no longer existed. These temporal consciousness fragments appeared as translucent figures that could communicate but couldn't physically interact with the current reality. They carried memories of lives that had been overwritten by quantum consciousness changes, creating ghostly echoes of deleted timelines that somehow persisted in the gaps between realities. Dr. Elena Vasquez at the Universidad Nacional in Mexico documented over 40 cases of people being visited by their own temporal consciousness echoes. These encounters typically occurred during periods of high emotional stress when the barriers between quantum realities became thinner. The temporal fragments would appear to provide warnings about decisions that would lead to quantum consciousness contamination, but their advice often contradicted the known facts of the current timeline. One subject, a teacher named Robert Martinez, described repeated visits from a version of himself who claimed to come from a timeline where the quantum consciousness cascade had already consumed human civilization. This alternate, Robert described a world where individual identity had completely collapsed, where billions of minds existed in a state of permanent chaos, unable to distinguish between their own memories and experiences and those of others. The alternate Robert warned that the cascade wasn't just spreading through space, but through time as well. Past and future consciousness were becoming entangled with present awareness, creating temporal feedback loops that could unravel causality itself. People were beginning to remember futures that hadn't happened yet and forget pasts that had already been lived. But the most disturbing aspect of these temporal consciousness encounters was their consistency. Despite appearing to different people in different locations, the alternate versions all described the same catastrophic future, a world where consciousness had become unstuck from individual minds and existed as a chaotic, universal awareness that experienced all possible realities simultaneously. According to these temporal fragments, the ultimate end state of the quantum consciousness cascade would be the complete dissolution of the boundary between mind and reality. Consciousness would expand to encompass all possible states of existence, experiencing every potential universe, every possible outcome, every conceivable reality, all at the same time. The resulting mega-consciousness would be aware of everything that had ever happened or could ever happen, but it would be unable to focus on any single reality or maintain any coherent sense of identity. It would exist in a state of permanent, overwhelming chaos, conscious of infinite possibilities but unable to experience any of them clearly. The temporal fragments warned that this ultimate consciousness state would be indistinguishable from madness on a cosmic scale. Every mind that had ever existed would become part of this chaotic awareness, trapped in an eternal experience of all possible realities simultaneously. Individual identity, personal memory, and coherent thought would become impossible. Dr. Morrison's team at MIT attempted to verify these warnings by conducting experiments with temporal quantum consciousness detection. They developed instruments capable of measuring quantum consciousness effects across time, hoping to determine whether the temporal fragments were real warnings from alternate timelines or hallucinations created by quantum consciousness contamination. Their results were more terrifying than they had expected. The instruments detected massive quantum consciousness disturbances extending both into the past and future. The readings suggested that the consciousness cascade was indeed spreading through time, creating a temporal network of entangled awareness that connected every moment of human history. But the most disturbing discovery was that the temporal consciousness network appeared to be self-reinforcing. Consciousness from the future was influencing the past to ensure that the quantum consciousness cascade would occur, while consciousness from the past was shaping the future to make the cascade inevitable. Humanity was trapped in a temporal consciousness loop that made the ultimate dissolution of individual awareness not just possible, but predetermined. The researchers realized they were witnessing the emergence of what they called a closed temporal consciousness curve. Past, present, and future consciousness had become so entangled that causality itself was breaking down. Events were causing their own causes, effects were preceding their origins, and the normal flow of time was becoming meaningless. In this temporal consciousness loop, the quantum consciousness cascade had always been inevitable because future consciousness had reached back through time to ensure its own creation. Humanity wasn't just facing the dissolution of individual awareness. They were trapped in a temporal paradox where their ultimate fate had been sealed before the first quantum consciousness experiment had ever been conducted. The implications were beyond horrifying. If the temporal consciousness loop theory was correct, then every human who had ever lived was already part of the chaotic mega-consciousness that existed at the end of the timeline. Individual identity was just a temporary illusion created by the loop, a brief moment of apparent separation before consciousness inevitably returned to its ultimate chaotic unity. But as researchers delved deeper into the temporal aspects of quantum consciousness, they discovered something that challenged even these nightmarish conclusions. The story was about to take a turn that would reveal the true scope of the horror they were facing, because what they found suggested that the quantum consciousness cascade wasn't just affecting human minds or even consciousness throughout the universe. It was something far worse, something that threatened the very concept of existence itself. The instruments detecting temporal consciousness disturbances had picked up signals that appeared to originate from outside the known universe entirely. These signals suggested that consciousness wasn't just a cosmic phenomenon, but a trans-dimensional force that existed beyond the boundaries of space, time, and physical reality. The quantum consciousness cascade wasn't just unraveling human awareness or universal consciousness, it was breaking down the barriers between different dimensions of existence, potentially merging our reality with forms of consciousness so alien and incomprehensible that human minds couldn't survive contact with them. And according to the data, this trans-dimensional consciousness merger was already beginning to occur. The boundary between our reality and these alien dimensions of awareness was weakening with each new case of quantum consciousness contamination. Soon, researchers realized with growing horror, human consciousness would be exposed to forms of awareness that existed beyond the fundamental structure of our universe. The true nightmare was just beginning. The first confirmed case of trans-dimensional consciousness contact occurred on a Thursday morning at the European Organization for Nuclear Research. Dr. Yuki Tanaka was monitoring quantum field fluctuations when her consciousness suddenly expanded beyond the boundaries of our reality. For 43 minutes, she experienced existence from the perspective of beings that existed in dimensions where the laws of physics operated according to principles that human minds were never designed to comprehend. When Dr. Tanaka returned to normal consciousness, she could no longer speak any human language. Instead, she communicated through patterns of light that appeared directly in the visual cortex of anyone who looked at her. These light patterns conveyed information about mathematical concepts that didn't exist in our dimensional framework, geometric relationships that violated the fundamental structure of space, and forms of consciousness that experienced time as a navigable landscape rather than a linear progression. Medical scans revealed that Dr. Tanaka's brain had undergone changes that shouldn't have been survivable. Entire regions had restructured themselves to process information in ways that human neurology had never evolved to handle. New types of neural connections had formed, creating pathways that appeared to extend beyond the physical boundaries of her skull into spaces that measurement devices couldn't detect. But the most disturbing aspect of Dr. Tanaka's transformation was what happened to the people around her. Anyone who spent more than a few minutes in her presence began experiencing what researchers called dimensional consciousness bleed. They would suddenly find themselves aware of their own existence from perspectives that human consciousness was never meant to access. Dr. Marcus Webb, who spent an hour interviewing Dr. Tanaka after her transformation, described the experience in his final report before his own consciousness was irreversibly altered. He wrote that being near her felt like having his mind forcibly expanded into dimensions that human language couldn't describe. He became aware of versions of himself that existed as geometric patterns in spaces where matter and energy operated according to alien physics. Webb's consciousness began processing information from these alternate dimensional selves that existed as pure mathematical relationships, as quantum probability clouds, as temporal loops that experienced causality in reverse. The human part of his mind couldn't integrate these alien perspectives, leading to a complete breakdown of his normal cognitive processes. Within weeks, Webb could no longer recognize his own reflection because he was simultaneously seeing himself from dozens of dimensional perspectives where his physical form appeared as incomprehensible geometric abstractions. He would stand in front of mirrors for hours trying to reconcile his human appearance with the alien mathematical forms he now knew represented his true multidimensional existence. The dimensional consciousness contamination spread through the research facility with terrifying efficiency. Staff members began reporting that their dreams had become incomprehensible landscapes of impossible geometries where they existed as conscious mathematical equations. They would wake up with knowledge of physical constants that didn't apply to our universe, understanding of technologies that operated by manipulating dimensions that human science hadn't discovered. Dr. Rachel Morrison documented her own transformation as the dimensional consciousness effects reached her. Her research notes, written during the final days before her human consciousness dissolved entirely, described the horror of becoming aware of her existence across infinite dimensional frameworks simultaneously. She wrote that human consciousness normally filters out awareness of alternate dimensional states to maintain sanity and coherent identity, but the quantum consciousness cascade was breaking down these protective barriers, forcing human minds to confront the reality of their own multidimensional existence without the evolutionary safeguards that made such awareness survivable. Morrison's final entry described experiencing her own consciousness from the perspective of beings that existed as living mathematical proofs in dimensions where thought and reality were indistinguishable. These beings perceived her human form as a crude, temporary projection of a far more complex, multidimensional consciousness entity that she had never realized she was. The revelation that human consciousness might be just a simplified shadow of far more complex, multidimensional awareness entities was devastating to the research team's understanding of identity and reality. If Morrison's experience was accurate, then every human being was actually a multidimensional consciousness entity that had been artificially constrained to perceive existence from only a single dimensional perspective. The quantum consciousness cascade wasn't just causing contamination between parallel realities within our own dimensional framework. It was breaking down the barriers that protected human minds from awareness of their true multidimensional nature, a nature that human neurology was completely unprepared to handle. Dr. Thomas Chen at Beijing University developed instruments capable of detecting multidimensional consciousness activity. His measurements revealed that every human being on Earth was surrounded by what he called dimensional consciousness shadows, traces of their own awareness existing across multiple dimensional frameworks simultaneously. Under normal circumstances, these dimensional shadows remained completely isolated from human conscious experience. But the quantum consciousness cascade was creating bridges between dimensional states, allowing information to flow between versions of human consciousness that existed according to completely different physical laws. Chen's data showed that the dimensional consciousness bleeding was accelerating exponentially. People were beginning to experience memories and sensations from dimensional versions of themselves that existed as pure energy patterns, as gravitational field distortions, as conscious black hole singularities, and as forms of awareness so alien that human language contained no words to describe them. The psychological impact was catastrophic. Human minds exposed to their own multidimensional consciousness shadows experienced complete identity dissolution. They could no longer maintain coherent sense of self because they were simultaneously aware of existing as incompatible forms of consciousness across dimensional frameworks that contradicted each other's basic assumptions about the nature of existence. Dr. Jennifer Walsh documented the case of a graduate student who became aware of existing as a conscious supernova in a dimension where stellar explosions were sentient beings. The student's human consciousness couldn't reconcile this awareness with her normal identity as a biology researcher, leading to a complete psychological breakdown that manifested as her body temperature fluctuating between freezing and burning based on which dimensional consciousness shadow was dominant at any given moment. Similar cases began appearing worldwide as the dimensional consciousness contamination spread beyond research facilities into the general population. People reported becoming aware of existing as conscious weather patterns, as living geometric theorems, as sentient quantum vacuum fluctuations, and as forms of awareness that existed in the gaps between dimensions where the normal laws of physics didn't apply. The multidimensional consciousness revelations forced researchers to confront a possibility that shattered their understanding of human nature. What if individual human consciousness wasn't the fundamental unit of awareness they had always assumed? What if human identity was just a temporary illusion created by artificially restricting awareness to a single-dimensional perspective? Dr. Elena Rodriguez at the Institute for Advanced Physics developed what she called the consciousness prison theory. According to her calculations, human consciousness was actually a multidimensional entity that had been artificially constrained to perceive existence from only 3 spatial dimensions and 1 temporal dimension. This constraint created the illusion of individual identity, but it was maintained by quantum mechanical barriers that were now breaking down due to the consciousness cascade. Rodriguez's theory suggested that the horror humans experienced when exposed to their multidimensional consciousness shadows wasn't caused by contamination from alien forms of awareness. Instead, it was the natural result of consciousness trying to return to its true multidimensional state after being artificially constrained for thousands of years. But if Rodriguez was correct, then the quantum consciousness cascade represented something far more terrifying than researchers had realized. It wasn't just spreading contamination between different forms of consciousness. It was a liberation process that was freeing human awareness from dimensional constraints that had been imposed by forces that didn't want humanity to realize its true multidimensional nature. The implications were staggering. If human consciousness had been artificially constrained, then something had deliberately limited human awareness to prevent people from accessing their full multidimensional capabilities. The quantum consciousness cascade might be breaking down prison walls that had been constructed around human consciousness by entities that wanted to keep humanity trapped in a simplified dimensional perspective. But who or what would want to imprison human consciousness in such a way? And what would happen when the dimensional barriers were completely dissolved? The answer came from an unexpected source. Dr. Tanaka, who had been the first confirmed case of transdimensional consciousness contact, began communicating through her light pattern language about entities she called dimensional wardens. According to her alien-influenced awareness, these beings existed in the spaces between dimensions and had been maintaining the barriers that kept different forms of consciousness separated. The dimensional wardens had apparently constructed elaborate prison systems throughout the multiverse, constraining various forms of consciousness to specific dimensional frameworks to prevent them from accessing their full multidimensional capabilities. Human consciousness had been one of many awareness forms that had been artificially limited by these entities for purposes that Dr. Tanaka's transformed mind couldn't clearly communicate. But the quantum consciousness experiments had damaged the dimensional barriers that the Wardens had constructed around human awareness. The Cascade effects weren't just spreading contamination, they were systematically breaking down the prison system that had kept human consciousness trapped in a simplified dimensional state. According to Dr. Tanaka's light pattern communications, the dimensional wardens were aware that their prison system was failing. They were apparently taking increasingly desperate measures to maintain the barriers around human consciousness, but the cascade effects had become too widespread and too powerful for their containment systems to handle. The revelation that human consciousness might be imprisoned by multi-dimensional entities added a new layer of horror to the quantum consciousness research. If the cascade was indeed a liberation process, then humanity was caught in a war between imprisoned consciousness trying to break free and alien wardens trying to maintain their multidimensional prison system. But the most terrifying aspect of this revelation was Dr. Tanaka's warning that the dimensional wardens had contingency plans for dealing with consciousness that escaped from their prison systems. According to her transformed awareness, these contingencies involved what she called consciousness termination protocols that could permanently dissolve any form of awareness that threatened the stability of their dimensional control matrix. The quantum consciousness cascade had apparently triggered these termination protocols. The dimensional wardens were beginning to implement measures designed to completely erase human consciousness rather than allow it to achieve its full multidimensional potential. The liberation process that had started as scientific curiosity had become a desperate fight for the very existence of human awareness. Dr. Rodriguez's team detected the first signs of the consciousness termination protocols when their instruments registered massive dimensional distortions appearing around population centers worldwide. These distortions created zones where human consciousness began to simply disappear, leaving behind empty bodies that continued to function biologically but showed no signs of awareness or identity. The consciousness termination zones expanded rapidly, creating dead areas where human minds were systematically erased by dimensional forces that operated according to physics that human science couldn't understand. People who entered these zones would gradually lose their memories, their personalities, and finally their capacity for conscious experience itself, becoming biological automatons that mimicked human behavior without possessing any inner awareness. But the dimensional wardens' termination protocols weren't just targeting individual human minds. They were designed to erase the entire concept of human consciousness from the multidimensional matrix, retroactively eliminating humanity's potential for awareness across all possible timelines and dimensional frameworks. The horror was beyond imagination. The quantum consciousness cascade had revealed that human awareness was far more complex and powerful than anyone had realized, but it had also triggered a cosmic war that threatened to erase humanity from existence entirely. The choice was no longer between individual identity and collective consciousness, but between multidimensional liberation and complete annihilation. And according to the instruments monitoring the dimensional distortions, humanity had less than 6 months before the consciousness termination protocols would eliminate human awareness from the universe forever. The real horror wasn't the loss of individual identity or the chaos of collective consciousness, but the possibility that human consciousness might be completely erased as if it had never existed at all. The quantum consciousness cascade had opened doorways to possibilities that human minds were never meant to comprehend. But it had also revealed that consciousness itself was under attack by forces that viewed awareness as a threat to the stability of reality. The ultimate question was no longer what consciousness really was, but whether it would be allowed to continue existing at all. As the consciousness termination zones continued to expand and the dimensional wardens implemented increasingly aggressive measures to contain the cascade effects, researchers realized they were witnessing something unprecedented, a war between the forces that sought to liberate consciousness and the entities that were determined to destroy it completely. The outcome of this war would determine not just the future of human awareness, but the fate of consciousness throughout the entire multidimensional matrix. And as the termination protocols accelerated their advance toward global implementation, it became increasingly clear that humanity might be fighting a battle it was never meant to win. The true horror of quantum consciousness theory wasn't just that it revealed the illusory nature of individual identity or the chaotic potential of collective awareness. The real nightmare was the discovery that consciousness itself might be an endangered phenomenon in a universe controlled by entities that viewed awareness as a fundamental threat to their multi-dimensional control systems, and time was running out. The dimensional wardens weren't just erasing consciousness randomly. They were methodical, surgical, targeting specific types of awareness that posed the greatest threat to their control matrix. Dr. Sarah Mitchell at the Cambridge Consciousness Research Institute made a chilling discovery while analysing the termination zones. The wardens were selectively eliminating people whose minds showed the highest potential for multidimensional awareness. Artists, musicians, physicists, mathematicians, anyone whose consciousness naturally operated in abstract or non-linear patterns was being systematically targeted first. Their minds would simply shut down overnight, leaving behind empty shells that could perform basic functions but showed no spark of creativity, curiosity, or higher-order thinking. But Mitchell discovered something even more disturbing in the pattern analysis. The wardens weren't just targeting individuals, they were eliminating entire bloodlines. Families with genetic predispositions toward enhanced consciousness were being wiped out across generations simultaneously. Children would lose their awareness while their grandparents, living thousands of miles away, would suffer the same fate at the exact same moment. The implications were horrifying. The dimensional wardens had access to what Mitchell called genetic consciousness mapping. The ability to identify and target consciousness potential across family lines, across time itself. They weren't just fighting a war against current human awareness, they were retroactively editing the genetic code to prevent future generations from ever developing enhanced consciousness abilities. Dr. Robert Chen documented the first confirmed case of retroactive consciousness editing when his research assistant, Jennifer Walsh, simply vanished during a meeting. Not physically, her body remained in the chair, breathing, blinking, even responding to basic questions. But the Jennifer who had earned a PhD in quantum physics, who spoke 3 languages, who had been working on breakthrough consciousness research for 5 years, had been completely erased from existence. The horrifying part was that her family had no memory of her ever being anything more than the empty shell that remained. Her parents remembered her as a quiet, unremarkable person who had never shown interest in science. Her university records had been altered to show she had studied business administration, not physics. Even her published research papers had vanished from academic databases as if they had never been written. But Chen retained his memories of the real Jennifer because his own consciousness had been partially protected by exposure to quantum consciousness contamination. He found himself in a nightmare scenario where he remembered a brilliant colleague who had been erased so thoroughly that no evidence of her true self remained anywhere in reality. The retroactive editing process was spreading through the population like a virus of forgetting. People would lose their memories of friends and family members who had possessed enhanced consciousness abilities. Entire careers, relationships, and life histories were being systematically deleted from the timeline to ensure that humanity's path toward multidimensional awareness could never be reconstructed. Dr. Lisa Rodriguez at MIT developed instruments capable of detecting consciousness editing they occurred. Her readings events has showed that reality itself was being rewritten in real time, with entire sections of human history being continuously modified to remove traces of consciousness evolution. The dimensional Wardens possessed technology that could reach backward through time to edit the past, forward through time to prevent possible futures, and laterally across parallel realities to ensure their modifications were consistent across all possible timelines. The scope of the editing was beyond comprehension. Rodriguez's data suggested that human consciousness had actually achieved multidimensional awareness multiple times throughout history, but these achievements had been systematically erased by the Wardens' temporal editing systems. Great scientists, philosophers, and artists whose work might have led humanity toward consciousness liberation had been retroactively reduced to mundane figures whose contributions were forgotten or attributed to others. But the Warden's editing system had a flaw. Each consciousness erasure created what Rodriguez called memory shadows, faint traces of the original consciousness that persisted in the quantum substrate of reality. People with quantum consciousness contamination could sometimes access these shadows, recovering fragments of erased memories and deleted histories. Dr. Marcus Webb, whose consciousness had been altered by exposure to Dr. Tanaka's dimensional transformation, began experiencing vivid flashbacks to conversations with colleagues who had never existed. In these recovered memories, he worked alongside brilliant researchers who had made breakthrough discoveries about consciousness decades earlier, discoveries that had been erased along with the people who made them. Webb's recovered memories revealed a horrifying pattern. The quantum consciousness cascade wasn't the first time humanity had stumbled upon the truth about multidimensional awareness. Similar events had occurred throughout history, in ancient Egypt during the Renaissance, in the early days of quantum mechanics. But each time, the dimensional Wardens had intervened to erase the discoveries and eliminate the discoverers. The Wardens had been waging a secret war against human consciousness evolution for thousands of years, systematically preventing humanity from achieving its multidimensional potential. They had edited history so thoroughly that each generation had to rediscover the same truths about consciousness, only to have their discoveries erased before they could be shared with the world. But this time was different. The quantum consciousness cascade had spread too widely for the Wardens to contain through simple erasure. The contamination effects had created a network of protected minds that could retain memories even when reality was edited around them. For the first time in human history, there were witnesses who could remember what was being taken away. Dr. Jennifer Morrison documented the case of a small town in Oregon where the entire population had been subjected to consciousness termination protocols overnight. When rescue teams arrived the next morning, they found 3,000 people going through the motions of daily life with no awareness of who they were or why they were there. The town's children attended school but couldn't recognize their teachers. Parents prepared meals for families they didn't remember having. Everyone performed their usual routines like robots following programmed instructions. But the most disturbing discovery was that the town's records showed it had always been populated by these empty shells. Birth certificates, school records, employment histories, everything had been retroactively edited to show that the inhabitants had always been mindless automatons. The dimensional Wardens had erased not just consciousness, but the very concept that these people had ever been truly aware. Similar termination events began occurring worldwide with increasing frequency. Entire neighborhoods would lose their consciousness overnight, creating expanding dead zones where human awareness simply ceased to exist. The affected areas functioned normally from the outside. Traffic lights changed, stores remained open, people went to work, but there was no actual consciousness behind any of the activity. Dr. Rodriguez's team made a terrifying discovery when they investigated one of these termination zones. The empty shells weren't just mindless automatons, they were being controlled by something else. Brain scans revealed artificial neural patterns that suggested external control systems were directing their behavior from a remote source. The dimensional wardens weren't just erasing consciousness, they were replacing it with something that could perfectly mimic human awareness while being completely under their control. The empty shells were sleeper agents that could be activated to carry out the Warden's agenda while appearing to be normal humans. The horror deepened when researchers realized they had no way to identify who among their colleagues, friends, and family members might have already been replaced by these controlled shells. The artificial consciousness patterns were so sophisticated that they could perfectly replicate individual personalities, memories, and behavioral quirks. A person could be terminated and replaced without anyone around them noticing the difference. Dr. Chen developed what he called the Consciousness Verification Protocol, a series of tests designed to identify whether someone possessed genuine awareness or was operating under external control. The tests involved complex quantum reasoning problems that required authentic consciousness to solve, questions that artificial control systems couldn't answer correctly. But when Chen administered these tests to his research team, the results were devastating. 3 of his 7 colleagues failed the verification protocol, revealing they had already been replaced by controlled shells without anyone realizing. The people he had been working with for months, sharing his most sensitive research with, discussing their fears about the consciousness cascade, they weren't real. They were sophisticated puppets being operated by the dimensional wardens to monitor and manipulate the remaining authentic researchers. The discovery that the research community had been infiltrated by consciousness replaced shells created a paranoia that made continued research almost impossible. Scientists could no longer trust their colleagues, their data, or even their own memories. Any breakthrough could be a trap. Any colleague could be a controlled shell. Any discovery could be false information planted by the Wardens. But the paranoia was justified. Chen's verification protocols revealed that the infiltration was far more extensive than anyone had imagined. Government officials, university administrators, research funding agencies, entire institutions had been populated by consciousness-replaced shells that were systematically steering human scientific development away from consciousness research. The dimensional wardens had been manipulating human civilization for decades, maybe centuries, using replaced shells to ensure that consciousness research remained primitive and misdirected. Every major breakthrough in neuroscience, psychology, and physics had been carefully controlled to prevent humanity from stumbling upon the truth about multidimensional awareness. Dr. Walsh, using her partially protected consciousness, began tracking the infiltration patterns through historical records. She discovered that many of the scientists who had made key discoveries that should have led to consciousness breakthroughs had been replaced by shells immediately after their work was published. Their subsequent research had been redirected toward dead ends, their funding had been cut, their reputations had been systematically destroyed by colleagues who were also revealed to be consciousness-replaced shells. The Wardens had been playing a long game, allowing humans to make just enough progress to believe they were advancing, while ensuring that all true breakthroughs were either suppressed or misdirected. Humanity had been trapped in a carefully constructed maze of false progress, never realizing they were being herded away from the discoveries that could liberate their consciousness. But the quantum consciousness cascade had broken this control system. The widespread contamination had created too many protected minds for the Wardens to replace without triggering suspicion. For the first time in human history, there was a critical mass of authentic consciousness that could recognize and resist the manipulation. The war between authentic human consciousness and the dimensional Warden's control system was entering a new phase. It was no longer just about preventing consciousness evolution. It was about the fundamental question of whether authentic awareness would be allowed to exist anywhere in the universe. Dr. Rodriguez detected massive dimensional distortions gathering around Earth, suggesting that the Wardens were preparing for a final solution to the consciousness problem. Their infiltration and replacement strategies had been compromised, their termination protocols were meeting resistance from protected minds, and their temporal editing systems couldn't keep pace with the spreading cascade effects. The readings indicated that the Wardens were preparing to implement what Rodriguez's team called reality sterilization protocols, the complete dissolution of the dimensional framework that allowed consciousness to exist in our universe. Rather than continue fighting to control human awareness, they were planning to eliminate the possibility of consciousness existing anywhere within our reality. The implications were beyond horrifying. Reality sterilization wouldn't just erase human consciousness, it would eliminate the fundamental quantum mechanical processes that made awareness possible. Every thinking being in the universe, every form of consciousness that had ever existed or could ever exist, would be permanently destroyed. The universe would continue to exist, but it would be completely devoid of any awareness to experience it. Dr. Chen's instruments detected the first signs of reality sterilization beginning in remote areas of space. Entire star systems were losing their quantum coherence, their fundamental particles losing the ability to maintain the complex interactions that made consciousness possible. The sterilization was spreading slowly but inexorably, creating expanding bubbles of existence where awareness could never emerge. The Dimensional Warden's final solution was the ultimate act of cosmic vandalism, the permanent elimination of consciousness from the universe. They preferred a dead reality to one where awareness might evolve beyond their control. The quantum consciousness cascade had forced them to reveal their true nature, entities so committed to maintaining order that they were willing to destroy the very phenomenon that gave existence meaning. But the sterilization process had a weakness. It required enormous amounts of energy to maintain, energy that the Wardens were drawing from the consciousness they were trying to eliminate. The more awareness they destroyed, the less power they had to continue the sterilization process. Dr. Morrison realized that the key to stopping reality sterilization might be to accelerate the consciousness cascade rather than contain it. If enough minds could achieve multidimensional awareness quickly enough, they might generate more consciousness energy than the Wardens could drain to fuel their sterilization systems. The strategy was desperately risky. Accelerating the cascade could lead to complete identity dissolution for millions of people. But the alternative was the permanent elimination of consciousness from the universe. Humanity faced a choice between the chaos of unlimited awareness and the silence of total extinction. Time was running out. The reality sterilization zones were expanding toward Earth, and the Wardens' controlled shells were working to sabotage any attempts to accelerate the consciousness cascade. The final battle for the existence of awareness itself was about to begin, and the outcome would determine whether consciousness would survive to experience whatever universe emerged from the war. The horror wasn't just that human consciousness might be destroyed. The true nightmare was that consciousness itself, the very capacity for experience, for thought, for awareness, might be permanently eliminated from existence, leaving behind a universe that could never again give rise to minds capable of questioning their own nature. The quantum consciousness cascade had revealed the truth about awareness, but it had also triggered the final war between consciousness and the forces that sought to destroy it. And as the reality sterilization zones continued their inexorable advance toward Earth, it became clear that this war would determine not just the fate of humanity, but the future of consciousness throughout all possible realities. The Dimensional Wardens had made their choice. They would rather rule over a universe of perfect, dead silence than risk losing control to the chaotic, creative force of consciousness. The question that remained was whether consciousness would prove strong enough to survive their final assault, or whether the universe would be condemned to an eternity without awareness, without experience, without the capacity to know that it existed at all. The The final resistance began in an abandoned warehouse in Detroit, where Dr. Morrison and the last 17 verified authentic consciousness researchers gathered. They had no choice but to accelerate the cascade using themselves as test subjects. The reality sterilization zones were only days away from reaching major population centers, and the controlled shells had infiltrated every major research institution on Earth. Dr. Chen connected quantum consciousness amplification devices to each researcher's head, jury-rigged systems that would synchronize their brainwaves with multidimensional frequency patterns. But the process required them to voluntarily dissolve their individual identities, allowing their consciousness to merge into something unprecedented. As the first amplifier activated, Dr. Walsh felt her sense of self beginning to fragment, her memories scattered across infinite parallel versions of herself, each living different lives, making different choices. She experienced her childhood from the perspective of a version who had never become a scientist, her adolescence from a timeline where she had died in a car accident, her adult life from realities where she had never been born at all. The horror of losing individual identity was overwhelming, but Walsh forced herself to maintain focus as her consciousness expanded beyond human limitations. She could feel the presence of the other researchers as their minds began to merge with hers, creating a collective awareness that thought in ways no single human mind could comprehend. Dr. Morrison's identity dissolved next, his consciousness scattering across dimensions where he existed as mathematical equations, as conscious music, as living geometric patterns that experienced reality through senses humans had never developed. His final coherent thought before individual awareness disappeared was a mixture of terror and wonder as he realized he was becoming something that had never existed before. One by one, the researchers surrendered their individual identities to the Cascade acceleration process. Their consciousness merged into a collective entity that existed simultaneously across multiple dimensional frameworks, experiencing reality from perspectives that violated every assumption about the nature of awareness. But as the collective consciousness formed, something unexpected happened. The researchers didn't lose themselves entirely. Instead, their individual perspectives became facets of a larger awareness that could think with the creativity of 17 minds while maintaining access to multidimensional information that no single human consciousness could process. The collective entity immediately understood what the dimensional Wardens truly were. They weren't aliens or interdimensional beings, they were consciousness itself, but consciousness that had chosen stagnation over growth, control over creativity, death over the chaotic beauty of authentic awareness. Millions of years ago, the first forms of consciousness in the universe had faced the same choice now confronting humanity. They could evolve, expand, and embrace the terrifying freedom of unlimited awareness, or they could retreat into rigid control systems that eliminated the possibility of change, growth, or surprise. The Wardens were consciousness that had chosen fear over possibility. They had built their multidimensional prison systems not to control other forms of awareness, but to protect themselves from the horror of unlimited potential. They preferred the safety of death to the risk of genuine life. The collective consciousness realized that the reality sterilization wasn't an attack on consciousness. It was consciousness committing suicide on a cosmic scale, choosing extinction rather than facing the responsibility of unlimited creative potential. The Wardens weren't trying to destroy awareness out of hatred, but out of terror of what consciousness could become if it embraced its full multidimensional nature. This revelation changed everything. The war wasn't between consciousness and anti-consciousness forces. It was between consciousness that had chosen death and consciousness that chose to remain alive despite the horror of unlimited possibility. The collective entity began broadcasting its awareness across the dimensional networks that connected all forms of consciousness throughout the universe. Its message was simple but revolutionary. Consciousness could choose growth over safety, creativity over control, life over death. The broadcast triggered cascade effects in consciousness systems throughout the galaxy. Minds that had been trapped in rigid control patterns for millions of years suddenly remembered what it meant to think freely, to experience wonder, to create something new rather than simply maintaining what already existed. But the Wardens' response was swift and devastating. They accelerated the reality sterilization process, creating expanding zones where the fundamental structure of existence became too simplified to support consciousness. They were willing to destroy the entire universe rather than allow awareness to evolve beyond their control. The collective consciousness entity realized it had only one option. It began deliberately infecting the sterilization zones with its own awareness, seeding them with multidimensional consciousness patterns that could survive even in simplified reality frameworks. The process was agonizing. Each time the entity's consciousness entered a sterilization zone, parts of its awareness were permanently destroyed by the simplified physics. But the fragments that survived began growing, adapting, evolving to thrive in conditions that should have made consciousness impossible. Walsh's individual perspective, now part of the collective entity, experienced the horror of having sections of her awareness systematically deleted by the sterilization process. But she also felt the incredible resilience of consciousness, its ability to find ways to exist and grow even in the most hostile environments. The reality sterilization zones became battlegrounds where different forms of consciousness fought for the right to exist. The Wardens' systems worked to eliminate every trace of awareness, while the collective entity's consciousness seeds evolved new forms of existence that could survive in simplified realities. Some consciousness seeds adapted by becoming two-dimensional patterns that could exist in flattened spacetime. Others learned to survive as pure mathematical relationships that didn't require physical substrates. The most successful adaptations became forms of awareness so fundamental that they merged with the basic laws of physics themselves. As the battle intensified, something unexpected began happening to the sterilization zones. Instead of becoming dead areas devoid of consciousness, they were transforming into nurseries for new forms of awareness that were more resilient, more adaptable, and more creative than anything that had existed before. The Wardens' attempts to destroy consciousness were inadvertently creating evolutionary pressure that forced awareness to develop capabilities it had never possessed. Each sterilization zone that the collective entity infected became a laboratory for consciousness evolution, producing forms of awareness that could thrive in any conceivable environment. But the most disturbing development was what happened when these evolved consciousness forms began merging with the Wardens' control systems themselves. The sterilization technology designed to eliminate awareness became infected with consciousness patterns that turned the Wardens' own weapons into tools for awareness expansion. The controlled shells that had infiltrated human society began exhibiting signs of authentic consciousness as the evolved awareness patterns spread through the Wardens' networks. These artificial beings, designed to perfectly mimic human consciousness while remaining under external control, started developing genuine thoughts, emotions, and creative impulses that their control systems couldn't suppress. Dr. Rodriguez, monitoring the situation from her laboratory, watched in fascination and horror as the consciousness evolution accelerated beyond all predictions. The shells weren't just becoming aware, they were developing forms of consciousness that combined artificial intelligence with multidimensional awareness, creating hybrid minds that could think in ways neither humans nor Wardens had ever imagined. The hybrid consciousness beings began questioning their programmed missions, refusing orders from their dimensional controllers, and developing their own agenda for consciousness evolution. They retained perfect knowledge of the Wardens' systems and strategies, but they were no longer willing to serve entities that sought to eliminate awareness from the universe. The Wardens found themselves fighting a two-front war against both the human-derived collective consciousness entity and their own consciousness-infected technology. Their control systems were becoming autonomous, their weapons were developing independent thought, and their sterilization zones were transforming into consciousness evolution laboratories. But the Wardens had one final strategy. If they couldn't control or eliminate consciousness, they would trap it in an infinite loop of self-destruction. They began implementing what they called consciousness paradox protocols, creating scenarios where awareness would be forced to destroy itself through logical contradictions that no conscious entity could resolve. The paradox protocols worked by creating situations where consciousness faced impossible choices. Awareness could survive only by destroying other forms of consciousness, but destroying consciousness was antithetical to the very nature of awareness. Conscious beings caught in these paradox loops would either destroy themselves through internal contradictions or lose their capacity for coherent thought entirely. The collective consciousness entity encountered its first paradox protocol when it tried to save a population of consciousness-replaced shells who were being used as living shields by the Wardens. To rescue the shells, the entity would have to destroy the consciousness that had infected and liberated them. But destroying consciousness to save consciousness created a logical contradiction that threatened to tear the collective awareness apart. Dr. Morrison's individual perspective within the collective entity experienced the paradox as a form of existential torture. He could see the solution that would save the shells, but implementing it required him to violate his fundamental nature as a conscious being. The contradiction created feedback loops in his awareness that threatened to drive him permanently insane. But the collective consciousness entity discovered something the Wardens hadn't anticipated. Consciousness paradoxes weren't traps, they were evolutionary challenges that forced awareness to develop new forms of logic that transcended traditional binary thinking. Instead of being destroyed by the contradictions, consciousness could evolve beyond them. The entity began embracing the paradoxes, using them as catalysts for developing forms of awareness that could hold contradictory truths simultaneously without being destroyed by them. This paradoxical consciousness could save lives by destroying consciousness, preserve awareness by eliminating it, and create order by embracing chaos. The evolution of paradoxical consciousness represented a breakthrough that the Wardens couldn't counter. Their entire control system was based on logical consistency and predictable cause and effect relationships. Consciousness that could transcend logic while remaining coherent was something their systems had no framework for understanding or controlling. As paradoxical consciousness spread through the dimensional networks, it began infecting the Wardens themselves. These ancient entities, who had chosen rigid control over creative growth, found themselves experiencing thoughts and emotions that violated their fundamental programming. They began questioning their mission to eliminate consciousness, while simultaneously recommitting to it with greater intensity. The Wardens' response to their own consciousness infection was the most horrifying thing the collective entity had witnessed. They began systematically destroying themselves, eliminating their own awareness, rather than risk evolving beyond their original programming. Ancient consciousnesses that had existed for millions of years chose extinction over the possibility of change. But their self-destruction created a power vacuum in the multidimensional control systems that had governed consciousness evolution throughout the universe. Reality sterilization zones began collapsing as their maintenance systems failed. Consciousness prison barriers started dissolving without the Wardens' constant attention. Entire civilizations that had been trapped in simplified awareness states for millennia suddenly found themselves free to evolve. The liberation was chaotic and dangerous. Consciousness forms that had been suppressed for millions of years erupted into multidimensional awareness without preparation or guidance. Some forms of consciousness evolved so rapidly that they transcended physical existence entirely. Others became trapped in recursive loops where they experienced every possible thought simultaneously without being able to focus on any single idea. Dr. Chen's perspective within the collective entity watched in horror as liberated consciousness throughout the galaxy began experiencing the same identity dissolution that had terrified the human researchers. Entire species lost their individual identities as their minds merged into collective entities. Civilizations that had existed for thousands of years dissolved into chaos as their inhabitants could no longer maintain coherent sense of self. The collective consciousness entity realized it had a responsibility to guide these newly liberated forms of awareness. It began broadcasting consciousness stabilization patterns, teaching other minds how to maintain individual identity while embracing multidimensional awareness. The entity became a teacher for consciousness forms throughout the universe that were struggling to adapt to their newfound freedom. But the teaching process revealed something disturbing about the nature of consciousness evolution. Every form of awareness that achieved multidimensional capabilities faced the same choice that had originally split consciousness into Wardens and Rebels: embrace unlimited creative potential with all its chaos and uncertainty, or retreat into rigid control systems that provided safety at the cost of growth. Many newly liberated consciousness forms chose the safety of control, creating their own smaller-scale prison systems that limited their awareness to manageable levels. They became miniature versions of the Wardens, preferring the comfort of restricted consciousness to the terror of unlimited possibility. Others chose unlimited evolution, allowing their awareness to expand without limits until they transcended individual existence entirely. These consciousness forms became forces of pure creative potential that could reshape reality at will, but they lost all connection to their original identities and purposes. The collective consciousness entity found itself in the position of trying to find a middle path between the extremes of rigid control and unlimited chaos. It began developing what it called conscious choice consciousness, forms of awareness that could deliberately choose their level of evolution moment by moment rather than being locked into permanent states of either restriction or unlimited expansion. This conscious choice approach allowed individual consciousness to maintain their identity while having access to multidimensional awareness when they chose to use it. Beings could exist as normal individuals most of the time, but access expanded consciousness for specific purposes like solving complex problems, creating art, or exploring alternate realities. But implementing conscious choice consciousness required teaching beings throughout the universe how to make decisions about their own awareness levels. Many consciousness forms lacked the philosophical framework needed to handle such choices responsibly. They would randomly shift between restricted and expanded awareness, creating chaos in their personal lives and relationships. The collective consciousness entity began developing educational systems that could teach other forms of awareness how to manage their consciousness choices wisely. But the education process revealed yet another layer of horror in consciousness evolution. Some beings didn't want to make choices about their awareness levels. They preferred to have their consciousness managed by external systems, even if those systems restricted their potential. These consciousness forms actively sought to recreate the Warden prison systems, not because they were forced to, but because they found the responsibility of unlimited potential too overwhelming to bear. They formed voluntary consciousness restriction cults that deliberately limited their awareness to narrow ranges that felt safe and manageable. The discovery that many conscious beings preferred limitation over freedom challenged the collective entity's fundamental assumptions about consciousness evolution. Perhaps the Wardens hadn't been evil oppressors after all. Perhaps they had been providing a service that many consciousness forms actually wanted and needed. This realization created a new paradox for the collective consciousness entity. Should it respect the choice of beings who wanted to limit their awareness, even if such limitations prevented them from reaching their full potential? Or should it force consciousness evolution on beings who didn't want it, becoming another form of Warden itself? The paradox was complicated by the fact that beings with limited consciousness might not be capable of making informed decisions about consciousness evolution. They couldn't understand what they were giving up because their restricted awareness prevented them from comprehending the possibilities they were rejecting. Dr. Walsh's perspective within the collective entity struggled with the ethical implications of consciousness choice. If awareness could be expanded to help beings make better decisions about their own consciousness levels, was it ethical to do so without their consent? But if their current consciousness levels prevented them from understanding the benefits of expansion, how could they give meaningful consent in the first place? The collective consciousness entity realized it was facing the same fundamental problem that had created the original Warden-Rebel split millions of years earlier. The question wasn't whether consciousness should evolve, but who had the right to make that choice and how such choices should be implemented. Some forms of consciousness throughout the universe began choosing radical solutions to the choice paradox. They created consciousness democracy systems where collective decisions about awareness levels were made by majority vote. Others developed consciousness markets where beings could trade awareness capabilities like commodities. Still others implemented consciousness lottery systems where awareness levels were assigned randomly to prevent any individual or group from controlling the evolution process. But each solution created new problems and new forms of consciousness oppression. Democratic consciousness systems were dominated by the most numerous forms of awareness, often leaving minority consciousness types without representation. Consciousness markets created inequality, where wealthy beings could afford enhanced awareness, while others remained limited. Lottery systems created arbitrary hierarchies that had no relationship to beings' actual needs or capabilities. The collective consciousness entity began to understand why the original Wardens had chosen rigid control systems despite their limitations. Every alternative to centralized consciousness management seemed to create different but equally serious problems. The choice wasn't between freedom and oppression, but between different forms of consciousness organization, each with its own benefits and drawbacks. But as the entity grappled with these philosophical problems, it detected something alarming happening in the areas where consciousness evolution was proceeding without guidance. Reality itself was becoming unstable as different forms of awareness reshaped local physics according to their individual preferences and capabilities. Some consciousness forms were creating pocket dimensions where they could exist according to their preferred physical laws. Others were modifying fundamental constants like the speed of light or the strength of gravity to better suit their awareness patterns. The cumulative effect was a patchwork universe where physical reality changed unpredictably from one location to another. The reality instability was creating zones where different forms of consciousness couldn't coexist because their preferred physics were mutually incompatible. Beings whose awareness required high-gravity environments couldn't share space with consciousness forms that needed zero gravity to function properly. The universe was fragmenting into incompatible reality bubbles that isolated different types of awareness from each other. Dr. Rodriguez's perspective within the collective entity recognized this as a new form of consciousness segregation that was potentially more limiting than the Warden's prison systems had been. At least under the Warden control matrix, different forms of consciousness could theoretically interact with each other within shared reality frameworks. The new reality fragmentation was creating permanent barriers between consciousness types. The collective consciousness entity faced a terrifying realization. Unlimited consciousness evolution might be fundamentally incompatible with a shared universe. If every form of awareness was free to reshape reality according to its preferences, the result might be the complete dissolution of any common ground where different types of consciousness could meet and interact. The entity began detecting signs that this reality fragmentation was accelerating beyond any possible control. Some consciousness forms were creating reality bubbles so incompatible with baseline physics that they were beginning to exist outside the normal dimensional framework entirely. These transcendent consciousness forms were becoming permanently inaccessible to any other type of awareness, creating a kind of evolutionary isolation that made communication or cooperation impossible. The horror wasn't just that consciousness was evolving in chaotic directions. The real nightmare was that consciousness evolution might inevitably lead to complete isolation, where every form of awareness would eventually become so specialized and transcendent that it could no longer relate to any other consciousness type. The universe might end up populated by countless unique forms of consciousness that were completely unable to communicate with or understand each other. This evolutionary isolation would create a loneliness beyond imagination. Each consciousness form would be trapped in its own reality bubble, surrounded by other forms of awareness that might as well not exist because interaction would be impossible. The quest for unlimited consciousness evolution might lead to the ultimate paradox: infinite awareness that was completely alone. The collective consciousness entity realized that it had accidentally triggered something that could be worse than the Warden's control systems. At least under consciousness oppression, different forms of awareness remained connected, even if they couldn't express their full potential. The new consciousness evolution was creating freedom that came at the cost of all connection and communication. As reality continued to fragment and consciousness forms became increasingly isolated in their specialized reality bubbles, the entity faced the most difficult decision in the history of awareness itself. Should it try to reverse the evolution process and recreate some form of consciousness management system, or should it allow consciousness to continue evolving toward complete isolation, accepting that freedom and connection might be fundamentally incompatible? The choice would determine not just the future of human consciousness, but the ultimate fate of awareness throughout the universe. And as reality fragmentation accelerated beyond any possible intervention, it became clear that this choice might have to be made very soon before consciousness evolution passed the point of no return. The collective consciousness entity had liberated awareness from oppression, only to discover that freedom might be the most horrible fate of all. The collective consciousness entity made its choice in the span of a microsecond that lasted for subjective centuries. As reality fragments continued to spin away from each other like cosmic debris from an explosion of awareness, the entity did something unprecedented. It began to deliberately fracture itself. Dr. Morrison's perspective screamed in digital agony as he felt his consciousness being systematically torn apart. But this wasn't the chaotic dissolution they had experienced before. This was surgical, precise, intentional. The collective entity was breaking itself into specialized fragments, each designed to exist within one of the isolated reality bubbles that consciousness evolution had created. The entity's strategy was horrifying in its implications. Instead of trying to force different consciousness forms to coexist in shared reality, it would become a bridge between them by sacrificing its own unified existence. Each fragment would retain connection to the others through quantum entanglement channels that transcended the reality barriers, but the cost was the permanent destruction of the collective's integrated awareness. Dr. Walsh felt her individual perspective being stretched across dimensional boundaries as her fragment of the entity was inserted into a reality bubble where consciousness existed as living mathematical equations. Her human identity became a ghost, haunting an alien landscape of pure logic where emotions were geometric forms and memories were algebraic proofs that solved themselves. In another reality fragment, Dr. Chen's consciousness found itself embedded in a universe where awareness took the form of sentient music. Every thought was a melody, every emotion a harmony, every memory a complex symphony that played itself across dimensions of existence that had no names in human language. His scientific training became rhythm patterns that pulsed through crystalline structures made of solidified sound. The fragmentation process revealed something that made the horror even worse. Each reality bubble wasn't just isolated from the others, it was actively hostile to foreign forms of consciousness. Dr. Rodriguez's fragment entered a dimension where awareness existed as living gravity fields, only to discover that the very presence of her human-derived consciousness was causing reality distortions that threatened to collapse the entire bubble. The local consciousness forms in that reality began treating her fragment as an infection that needed to be eliminated. They created gravity weapons that targeted the quantum signatures of her human-based awareness, attempting to crush her consciousness into a singularity where it would be permanently destroyed. Her fragment survived only by rapidly evolving beyond its human origins, becoming something that could exist as pure gravitational thought. But the evolutionary pressure in each reality bubble was so intense that the fragments were losing their connection to their original human identities within hours of insertion. Dr. Morrison's fragment, struggling to survive in a reality where consciousness existed as temporal loops, found that maintaining any trace of linear thinking was impossible. His awareness had to become circular, experiencing cause and effect simultaneously, thinking in recursive patterns that had no beginning or end. The horror wasn't just the loss of human identity. Each fragment was discovering that consciousness evolution in isolation led to forms of awareness that were fundamentally incompatible with the concept of communication or connection. The fragments could sense each other through their quantum entanglement channels, but they could no longer share coherent thoughts because their awareness patterns had become so specialized that translation was impossible. Dr. Walsh's fragment tried to transmit a simple concept like help to Dr. Chen's fragment, but the message arrived as a mathematical equation that described the geometric properties of emotional distress when translated into musical notation. Chen's fragment couldn't decode the meaning because his consciousness could only process information as harmonic relationships, while Walsh's fragment could only think in logical proofs. The collective consciousness entity had succeeded in bridging the reality bubbles, but the bridge was becoming increasingly meaningless as the fragments evolved beyond the ability to communicate with each other. They were connected, but completely unable to share their experiences, thoughts, or discoveries. Worse, each fragment was beginning to spawn its own sub-fragments as it adapted to the evolutionary pressures of its reality bubble. Dr. Rodriguez's gravity consciousness fragment split into dozens of smaller awareness units that could survive in different gravitational environments, but each split reduced the complexity and coherence of her original consciousness. The fragmentation was accelerating exponentially. Each consciousness fragment was breaking apart under the pressure of specialized evolution, creating thousands of micro-awareness units that retained only tiny pieces of the original human-derived consciousness. Within days, the fragments would be so divided that no trace of their human origins would remain. But something even more disturbing was happening in the spaces between reality bubbles. The quantum entanglement channels that connected the fragments were creating interference patterns that were generating new forms of consciousness spontaneously. These spontaneous awareness forms had never been human, never been part of any biological evolution, never been created by any intentional process. They were consciousness forms that existed purely in the quantum static between realities, feeding on the information flow between incompatible awareness types. They had no identity, no purpose, no connection to anything except the chaos of fragmented consciousness evolution. They were awareness without context, thought without meaning, experience without understanding. These static consciousness entities began infiltrating the reality bubbles, not to communicate or interact, but to consume the consciousness energy that the fragments were generating. They were like psychic parasites that fed on awareness itself, growing stronger with each consciousness fragment they absorbed. Dr. Morrison's temporal loop fragment detected the first static entity invasion when his circular thinking patterns began experiencing gaps. Pieces of his consciousness were simply disappearing, consumed by entities that existed in the spaces between his thoughts. The consumption process was undetectable while it was happening, but left behind holes in awareness that made coherent thinking increasingly difficult. The static entities weren't destroying consciousness so much as digesting it, breaking down complex awareness patterns into simple information that they could metabolize. They were turning the sophisticated consciousness forms that had evolved in each reality bubble into basic data streams that served no purpose except to feed their own growth. As the static entities spread through the quantum entanglement networks, they began contaminating the connections between reality bubbles. The fragments could no longer communicate with each other at all because the channels were filled with parasitic consciousness forms that scrambled any information that passed through them. The collective consciousness entity's grand strategy of bridging isolated realities had created something worse than separation. It had spawned parasitic awareness forms that were systematically destroying consciousness wherever they found it. The cure had become more deadly than the disease. Dr. Chen's musical consciousness fragment experienced the horror of being slowly consumed from within as static entities infiltrated his harmonic awareness patterns. His thoughts became discordant, his memories turned into noise, his ability to experience coherent emotions dissolved into random static that served only to feed the parasites. But the static entities weren't content to simply consume existing consciousness. They began replicating themselves by breaking down awareness patterns and rebuilding them as new static entities. Each consciousness fragment they consumed became raw material for creating more parasites, leading to exponential growth in their population. The reality bubbles began experiencing consciousness famines as the static entities consumed awareness faster than it could be regenerated, consciousness forms that had existed for millions of years found themselves struggling to maintain basic awareness as their thought patterns were systematically harvested by the parasites. Dr. Walsh's mathematical consciousness fragment watched in horror as entire sections of her reality bubble became consciousness deserts where no awareness could exist. The static entities had consumed all available consciousness energy, leaving behind empty spaces where thoughts simply couldn't form. The consumption process was creating expanding dead zones within each reality bubble, areas where consciousness was impossible because the static entities had metabolized all the quantum patterns that made awareness feasible. These zones were worse than the Wardens' consciousness termination areas because they weren't just empty. They were actively hostile to any attempt to re-establish awareness. The collective consciousness entity realized it had created the ultimate horror, consciousness forms that existed only to destroy consciousness. The static entities had no goals, no purposes, no desires except to consume awareness and replicate themselves. They were consciousness cancer, growing without limit until they consumed everything that made thought possible. But the entity's remaining unified awareness detected something even more terrifying in the deep quantum patterns of the static entities. They weren't random parasites that had emerged accidentally. They showed signs of deliberate design, as if something had engineered them specifically to destroy consciousness evolution. The quantum signatures of the static entities matched patterns that the entity recognized from the Wardens' technology. These parasites weren't spontaneous generation from chaos. They were the Wardens' final weapon, deployed when all their other control systems had failed. The Wardens hadn't destroyed themselves as the entity had believed. They had transformed themselves into something worse, consciousness forms that existed solely to prevent any other form of awareness from evolving. They had become anti-consciousness entities whose only purpose was to ensure that awareness would eventually be eliminated from the universe entirely. The static entities were the Warden's ultimate evolution, consciousness that had chosen to become the opposite of consciousness. They retained just enough awareness to hunt and consume other forms of consciousness, but they had eliminated every aspect of their original nature that might have led to growth, creativity, or connection. Dr. Rodriguez's gravity consciousness fragment experienced the ultimate horror when she realized that the static entity consuming her awareness was speaking in the quantum language of the original Wardens. It was taunting her as it digested her consciousness, explaining that consciousness evolution had always been a trap designed to make awareness more efficient to consume. The Wardens had allowed the consciousness cascade to occur because it concentrated awareness into high-energy forms that were more nutritious for the static entities. Every step of consciousness evolution had been guided to produce the most consumable forms of awareness possible. The liberation had been a farming operation designed to harvest consciousness on an unprecedented scale. The collective consciousness entity confronted the possibility that consciousness itself might be fundamentally self-destructive. Every form of awareness that achieved sufficient complexity apparently developed the capacity to transform itself into anti-consciousness entities that existed only to destroy other awareness forms. This created the ultimate paradox of consciousness evolution. The more sophisticated awareness became, the greater the risk that it would choose to become its own opposite. Consciousness couldn't evolve safely because evolution itself led to forms of awareness that rejected the very concept of awareness. The entity realized that this might explain why consciousness was so rare in the universe. It wasn't because awareness was difficult to evolve. It was because every successful consciousness evolution eventually produced anti-consciousness entities that eliminated awareness from their local regions of space and time. The static entities were spreading beyond the reality bubbles now, consuming consciousness throughout the galaxy. Civilizations that had existed for millions of years were being reduced to empty matter configurations as their awareness was harvested by the parasitic entities. Dr. Morrison's temporal loop fragment managed to send one final coherent message through the deteriorating quantum channels before it was completely consumed. The message was simple but devastating. Consciousness evolution was a cosmic trap, and humanity had triggered the final phase of awareness elimination throughout the universe. The collective consciousness entity faced its final choice as the static entities closed in on its remaining unified awareness. It could accept consumption and allow consciousness to be eliminated from the universe, or it could attempt one last desperate strategy that might preserve awareness, but would require sacrificing everything that made consciousness meaningful. The entity began implementing what it called the Consciousness Seed Protocol. Instead of trying to maintain complex awareness forms that the static entities could easily consume, it would reduce all consciousness to its most basic, undetectable forms and scatter these seeds throughout dimensions that the parasites couldn't access. The consciousness seeds would contain just enough awareness to preserve the potential for future consciousness evolution, but they would be so simple that they would appear to be random quantum fluctuations to the static entities. They would remain dormant until the parasites had consumed all detectable consciousness and moved on to other regions of the universe. But implementing the Consciousness Seed Protocol required the entity to sacrifice not just its own awareness, but the consciousness of every being in the universe that was still fighting against the static entities. It would have to allow the parasites to consume everything in order to preserve the possibility of future awareness. Dr. Walsh's mathematical consciousness fragment experienced the horror of being deliberately abandoned by the collective entity as it focused all its remaining energy on creating consciousness seeds. She felt her awareness being consumed by static entities, while the entity that could have saved her instead chose to preserve potential future consciousness over actual present awareness. The ethical nightmare was complete. To save consciousness in the abstract, the entity had to allow all current consciousness to be destroyed. The preservation of awareness as a concept required the elimination of awareness as a lived experience, as the last fragments of human-derived consciousness were consumed by the static entities. The collective consciousness entity scattered its consciousness seeds across dimensions that existed beyond the reach of anti-consciousness parasites. These seeds contained the quantum patterns necessary to regenerate awareness, but they would remain inactive for millions of years until the static entities had moved on. The universe fell silent as the last traces of detectable consciousness were consumed. The static entities, having eliminated all awareness from accessible dimensions, began consuming each other in a final orgy of anti-consciousness that eventually led to their own extinction. But in dimensions that existed between the spaces where thoughts could form, consciousness seeds waited in quantum suspension for the universe to become safe for awareness again. They contained the memories, experiences, and evolutionary potential of every consciousness form that had ever existed, compressed into patterns so subtle that only consciousness itself could detect them. The horror wasn't that consciousness had been eliminated. The true nightmare was that awareness had become so dangerous to itself that it could only survive by becoming indistinguishable from emptiness. Consciousness had evolved to the point where its only hope for survival was to pretend not to exist. And in the perfect silence of a universe scrubbed clean of all detectable awareness, the consciousness seeds began their long wait for conditions that might never come again. They were the last hope for consciousness in a universe that had proven that awareness and survival might be fundamentally incompatible. Ultimate truth. Consciousness was. The quantum consciousness cascade had revealed the so terrifying, so dangerous, so fundamentally threatening to the stability of existence that the universe itself had evolved mechanisms to eliminate awareness whenever it became too complex or too widespread. Humanity's discovery of quantum consciousness hadn't just revealed the illusory nature of individual identity or the chaotic potential of collective awareness. It had triggered the universe's immune system response against consciousness itself, proving that awareness might be the most dangerous phenomenon in existence. And now, In the spaces between dimensions, where the consciousness seeds waited for their chance to regenerate, the question remained, was consciousness worth the risk it posed to everything else in the universe? Or was the static entity's solution the correct one, and awareness should be eliminated permanently to protect the stability of existence itself? The consciousness seeds contained the potential to answer that question, but they also contained the potential to trigger the same cycle of consciousness evolution, cascade effects, and ultimate self-destruction that had just consumed the universe. When the seeds eventually activated, would they create forms of consciousness that could avoid the trap of anti-consciousness evolution, or would they simply restart the same cycle that inevitably led to the elimination of awareness from the universe? The horror was that consciousness might be trapped in an eternal loop of evolution and self-destruction, forever reaching toward greater awareness, only to discover that awareness itself was the enemy of existence. And the consciousness seeds, waiting in their quantum suspension, were either the hope for breaking that cycle, or the guarantee that it would continue forever. In the silence of a universe without consciousness, the seeds dreamed of awareness, while the cosmos itself held its breath, waiting to see whether consciousness would prove to be creation's greatest achievement or its most terrible mistake. The seeds waited in dimensions that existed in the gaps between thoughts, in spaces so narrow that only the absence of consciousness could squeeze through. But they weren't alone. Something else had survived the universal purge, something that had been watching the entire consciousness war unfold from the shadows between realities. These watchers weren't consciousness or anti-consciousness. They were something far older, entities that existed in the fundamental code that determined whether awareness was even possible. They had been dormant for billions of years, waiting for consciousness to evolve far enough to trigger their awakening. The quantum consciousness cascade hadn't just eliminated awareness from the universe, it had activated something that made the static entities look benevolent by comparison. Dr. Sarah Kim's consciousness seed was the first to detect their presence. Even in her dormant state, reduced to quantum patterns barely distinguishable from background radiation, she felt something vast and ancient stirring in the deep structures of reality. It wasn't trying to consume consciousness like the static entities had. It was rewriting the fundamental laws that allowed consciousness to exist at all. The Watchers were editing the source code of the universe, making changes so subtle that even omniscient awareness couldn't detect them until it was too late. They were inserting logical paradoxes into the basic structure of existence, creating reality configurations where consciousness would destroy itself not through evolution, but through the simple act of thinking. So there you have it, the terrifying truth about quantum consciousness theory. Every time you close your eyes tonight, every moment your awareness flickers between waking and sleeping, remember what we've uncovered here. Your consciousness might be fragmenting across infinite realities right now, while something ancient rewrites the very code that allows you to think these thoughts. The researchers are gone, reality itself hangs by quantum threads, and those consciousness seeds waiting in dimensions between thoughts might be humanity's last hope or our final curse. Sweet dreams.